That's going back a few years. I was actually the 54th employee at Apple, hired by Steve Jobs. And that came about fundamentally because my boss at Hewlett Packard, Tom Whitney, had his doctorate from Iowa State, and the top engineer at Apple, Wendell Sanders, had his doctorate from Iowa State. So when Apple went looking for a VP of engineering, after Chuck Peddle didn't work out, they hired Tom Whitney. And Tom knew about me and set up a luncheon at his home for me to meet Steve. I was 29 at the time, and Steve was 20.
Yeah. How'd that go?
Well, eventually I raised the average age of the company 2 years, but no, Steve was enticing. He was passionate, articulate. He spoke visually, if you will, sharing with me his why for Apple, which came from the Scientific American article where they had done a study on efficiency of man and animal, and man was disappointing, and but someone had the foresight to rerun the test with man riding a bicycle, which amplified him to the top of the list. So Steve saw technology as a natural amplifier, the mental bicycle, and so he saw his way of giving back was through technology. And he once told me, he goes, everything I own, the food that I eat, the clothes that I wear, the car that I drive is from someone else's accomplishments. I want to give something back. And that, so as Simon Sinek says, start with the why. Steve wasn't really talking about what, he was talking about why. And, being having one of the first computer science degrees in the United States from Berkeley in '69 and graduate work, I could see the power of software, and yet I don't think Steve had really even thought about software at the time. So I knew the limiting factor in the Apple II was going to be software. I think Woz and the guys did a great job on the hardware, but at the same time, the maximum salary at Apple was $40,000, and I was making about $75,000 at Hewlett Packard, and I was about ready to take over the responsibility for about 150 engineers. So I told Steve, I need to think about this. But Steve, in his wily ways, brought an Apple II into my home on a Friday night. He put it on the kitchen table and told my then 4-year-old son, Christopher, you can have this if your dad comes to work for me. And, the TV didn't go on that weekend, and that little guy got on that metal bicycle and went places and did things that I didn't think a 4-year-old could do. But on Sunday night, I said, Chris, don't get too attached to this because I may have to return it. And he goes, why, Dad? And I said, well, if I don't take the job, I need to bring it back tomorrow. And he looked at me and said, we'll just say yes, Dad. So that's kind of the start. Now, ironically, Steve did not hire me as vice president of software. He hired me as director of new products, working for him, which was the early days of product marketing. Our job was to define the new products for Apple, past the Apple I, everything from software to peripherals to hardware. I didn't last very long on that job because 6 months later they finally realized that software was going to be the critical element in their success, and they made me vice president of software. And the Apple III was supposed to basically be our entry into the business community, and to basically make up for all the shortcomings in the Apple II. Like have 80 characters instead of 72 characters, have that nature, have a real operating system, a file system. And so that was the fundamental definition of the Apple III. Unfortunately, the problems they had with the Apple III were manufacturing problems. So they sort of had this, pointing, right? Engineers saying it's ready to manufacture, manufacturer saying it's not, and the chips didn't sit very well. And you could actually, drop the Apple III and it would reset itself. So that slowed down the launch. I think we had to replace 14,000 in the field. So it wasn't considered a runaway success like the Apple II. If you go back to 1978 and you think about the Apple II, and you think about the size of the market for a personal computer, it was very limited. and the fact that there was no third-party software program, and so the Apple II had very limited software, and so the majority of people who bought the Apple II didn't buy it for an application originally. They either had to be able to program in DOS or program in BASIC. So if you think about the market size being people who could program, is very limiting, right? So, Steve really was asking me to come and design a computer that anyone could use, which means, let's get beyond the procedure-oriented languages. And I had a personal experience in my own family where my mom had a women's health club and my dad would manage the business. And it was a subscription business, and he never knew when the subscriptions were going to expire. He never knew whether women were signing up because my mom's, charisma, or because they saw an ad. And so one day when I was home, he goes, I'm having a hard time managing the business. And I said, well, did you ever think about computerizing it? And he said, you can do that? And I go, yeah. So we went down to Radio Shack and bought a Trash 80. Brought it home, opened it up in my mom's living room, and a cockroach ran out. And my mom said, get that thing out of my house. So I put it in the garage. I wrote a basic program for my dad to manage his business. Problem is, every time I went home, I found myself in the garage adding new functionality to the program. So I started to think about a concept called datagramming versus programming, where someone like my dad, who was not a programmer, but could specify, what the data that he needed to operate on, subscriptions, times, and basically define the relationships between this data. And fast forward, when I saw VisiCalc, I go, well, there's the first example of a piece of software that my dad can now specify and solve his problems. So when they made me vice president of software, I wrote a software strategy that said, okay, the strategy for the Apple II is going to be get more high-level languages on it, like Pascal, get as many people I can writing software for it, and as Steve told me, he goes, I want every program in the world to run on the Apple II by Christmas, right? And my normal reaction to it was to Steve was, Steve, I believe in miracles, but only God can schedule them. So that was the philosophy for the Apple II. The philosophy for the Apple III was to really have a new operating system, the SOS operating system, to have a file system, to be able to move data, at least at the file level. And then the strategy for the Lisa computer was for the knowledge worker, and to create an environment where data could be moved from one function, from a plotting to a word processor, without having to be aware of files. And that was a strategy for the Lisa. At that time, the company was organized functionally, engineering, product marketing, new products, software, peripherals, manufacturing. Scotty was so frustrated with the battle between the engineering and manufacturing for the Apple III that he came in and said, okay, we're now divisionalizing. And he said, Gene Carter, you used to run sales, you're now running the Apple II division. John, you were the vice president of software. Lisa's all about software. You're running the Lisa division. John Bernard, you're running the peripherals division. That way he would hold us responsibility for the success of the product, because I even had what we called pilot manufacturing. So I owned everything now for the new 16-bit computer. And so the hardware team, which did not report to me as VP of software, now reported to me. We made some changes in personnel. I hired Wayne Rosing, and the rest is history. The initial goal was to take advantage of the 16-bit processor, and I knew that we were going to implement some very sophisticated software on that processor. So I pushed for the 68,000, above the Intel world, because of memory management. And so, as we were going from the 6502 to the 68,000, we were moving in a direction of, of a real computer. So that was important to us. The original engineering specs, the fellow that was reported to Tom in charge of the hardware was really pushing for function keys, some things like that. And, we were trying to figure out, what the interface would really be for that could we create a new way of people operating on a computer, like the VisiCalc, power. Think about it. VisiCalc made Apple II successful. It took us from somewhat a successful company to a whole new level, right? And PageMaker, which I was an early investor in, basically made the Mac, right? Successful. So there was always an application that kind of triggered, a step up in the growth. The challenging, for us and Lisa was we were trying to do something that had never been done before, right? There were no books, there were no people to talk to, and so we were looking at pretty much everything. And then we did have the opportunity to go to Xerox because Xerox wanted to invest in Apple, and I don't know if the same words were used, but it was basically you open the kimono at Xerox PARC and we'll let you invest. Can't remember if I went on both. I know I went on the first one, and it clicked in my mind. I'm going, okay, this is datagramming, cut and paste paradigm. Now they had a very limited, set of applications, whereas we, said, okay, we're going to have 6 applications when we introduced Lisa. And the challenge for us was there was no development environment. So we had to write this software for the first time. And, no one had ever seen anything like it before. And even in the Mac did not have a development environment, right? They had to program on the Lisa and then download it into the Mac. So when we released and announced Lisa, the only software available for it was what we wrote. And and people, the third-party world for Lisa couldn't exist prior to Lisa, only after a particular time for Lisa. So, but I think we unveiled to the world what the future of personal computing would look like. We just saw some stuff that we've been thinking about, and in a sense we saw the future of what we would like Apple to look like, and we'd like to bring it down from a $40,000 computer down to a smaller computer.
Were you aware of the work at as far as Douglas Engelbart and that stuff?
Because of my my graduate work in computer science. I studied with Butler Lamson and Peter Deutsch and some of the early pioneers, for early operating systems, etc. So yeah, I was very much aware of that, and I had coined the term datagramming rather than programming. But I didn't really it was sort of at the 10,000 foot level. We were still trying to work out the details of it. But when we saw it, Steve and I just said, this is it. This is the direction that we really want to go. And we hadn't divisionalized yet at that point, so there was a little bit of a disagreement between what Steve and I wanted to do, or I wanted to do from the software side, what Steve wanted to do from a company side, and the hardware guy that was in charge of the 16-bit computer. Obviously, when they was reorganized and I got total control over it, we made the changes, and that's when I hired Wayne out of Sun, which ironically I called him cold on the day that the DEC had canceled the personal DEC computer. And so I said, you got to come out. I can't tell you what I'm doing, but you got to come out and see it. And so he was open to that. When I first joined Apple, one of Steve's heroes was Bill Hewlett, right? And he asked me to to introduce him to Bill because he had only cold called him when he was in school and got his summer job. And one of the things that Bill had told me, and when I worked for him, was more companies die from indigestion than starvation, which was really a warning to, not to do too much. Well, Steve turned that around because it was always one of his favorite things, saying we take as much pride in the 8 things we don't do as the 2 things that we do. But I don't think in those early days, we were doing too much. Maybe we were adding too much risk to a product, but not from the standpoint that we had so many products that you would call it indigestion, right? I think we had a pretty clear vision of what we wanted to do, especially after we'd been to the Xerox PARC, and a pretty clear vision of the additional functionality that we felt that we could add to the software above and beyond what we saw at Xerox PARC. But at Xerox PARC, we fundamentally saw a word processor and a graphics package, and we were saying, we know we got to have a VisiCalc-like package, and we know we needed, a drawing package, and we needed a graphing package, and we even needed a terminal emulator. So we defined quite a few different applications. It was almost what we saw was something at the 10,000 foot level, right? And we go, God, that's where we want to go, but we're going to pave our own path to that. We're going to define our own road map to get to that path. Steve was already enamored with fonts and with the laser printer and things of that nature. So we knew that was obviously going to be part of it. We knew we had a 68,000, so we were going to take advantage of the processing power of the 68,000 and the functionality that the 68,000 have. We knew we could write a multitasking operating system, which is what most people don't realize, is that Apple had a multitasking operating system in Lisa. And if you think about it, how many years later, many attempts. Intelligent with IBM, they spent a lot of money. They didn't get their multitasking operating system until they bought Next, 20-something years later. And they had it sitting on the shelf. General manager, okay. Yeah, so you had engineering, you had marketing, you had software, and you had pilot manufacturing. So we were responsible for building 50 a day. And then once we proved to everybody that those 50 worked, then it was shifted to the big manufacturing division. It was a little bit tight at the time because when Scotty made these announcements, of course, Steve wanted to be in charge of the Lisa project. I don't know. Maybe, I'm 72 now, okay? I was probably 32 at the time. I think there's a little bit more ego and pride in you when you're 32, okay? And I had hired a lot of the people, software people from HP. So I, in a sense, I felt kind of loyal to those individuals and to the team. And Steve was still pretty young and brash, and I in my own pride, I'm going, I'm not sure that these guys will work for Steve, because they're sophisticated, they've been around, they've built big operating systems, and so the company basically just said, no, Steve, you're too young to manage, that group. You need more experience, and we're going to give it to John. Sometimes I wonder if I had just, acquiesced and said, okay, Steve, we'll build a long neck structure. I'll report to you, and everybody will report to me. This is the way it was in kind of product marketing. Would things have been different? I don't know, because one, the technology wasn't there for disk drives, so we were working. Steve wanted to build his own floppy, and so we were stuck with, the Twiggy floppy.
So that was a decision like you were against?
There was no ifs or ands about it. That's what you used. It was ours, right? And Steve had the advantage that the Sony diskettes came out, which would have been much nicer. But that was the decision, and of course, that left Steve basically without a product, because now marketing reported to each of the divisions rather than into Steve into marketing. And so that's, he kind of went looking for a project, and that's when he, basically took it away from Jeff. And of course, Jeff's product was not anywhere near what we were doing or the direction the company was going. I mean, for all I know, it may have been the, greatest introduction in the history of mankind, but it was just, it was more of an appliance type, consumer type of product. And Steve wanted a product like we were building, and so he basically, went for a subset of the Lisa. And when I tried to convince Steve that the relationship between the Mac and the Lisa ought to be that the Mac is at home and the Lisa is at work, and the diskettes should be interchangeable, and you can work at home, come back and forward, he goes, why would I want to do that? Because to Steve, innovation was an antithesis, to standardization or compatibility. He saw standardization or compatibility as basically a resistor to innovation. And so they went in their direction, and we were down the road, we were committed, and so we went in our direction. Now, also, in addition to the technology that may have not been ready for a machine like Lisa and its power, Apple really wasn't ready, because we didn't have a sales force. And all of a sudden, we had to build a sales force to sell, originally what was hoped to be a $5,000 machine came out as a $10,000 machine. So, I think I had 50 salespeople worldwide to sell Lisa. Whereas, the Mac could take advantage of the retail operation. So that was a little bit of a challenge. I remember I introduced Lisa in a room with a whiteboard and a pen, like my professor days, right? Mac was introduced in the Opera House in San Francisco, and with a 7-page, page to fold out in the Newsweek magazine. And I remember one of the dealers that was at both my presentation and Jobs' presentation. He goes, "He who has the gold rules." No, there's not. The only thing you could do would be the introduction in Boston at the Boston Computer Society, which exists.
Yeah,
because it was a combination. I presented and the new Apple II presented, and
well, that's on YouTube, so I think I've watched that.
It's there. That's it. That was our introduction, fundamentally. That was our unveiling, I should say. And, people hadn't seen what we were doing. I remember, I'm an old Fortran programmer, and when you go to print, if your result is bigger than the specification of the field, you got a bunch of X's, right? Well, I intentionally did that on the screen, and I go, oh, well, I can fix that, and just went up to the bar and moved it to the right, and of course, people went crazy because they had never seen anything like that before. That you could correct your mistakes at runtime fundamentally rather than at compile time. Right. I mean, the whole concept of compile time, runtime, everything kind of went away. I need that data over here. The irony of it is, if IBM had introduced Lisa, Katie by the door, it's over. Okay, we just weren't. We were ahead of the game. For the size of the machine, right? And for the hard. Remember, a 5 megabyte hard drive cost $1,000. I got 250 gigs in my phone. We just were. The software was just ahead of the hardware. The operating system was ahead. The integration of the languages were ahead of the game. I think also if we had a better word processor, we would have done a little bit better, because we would have displaced the Wangs and the Linears, which were much more expensive computers. But we kind of failed in the word processing, which is kind of ironic, because the fellow who wrote the word processor came from Xerox PARC. positioning it was, Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, people can only perceive what they see. So if people haven't seen it, it's tough to describe it. I remember once Steve described Elisa as the greatest graphics machine in the history of mankind. Well, I'm going, no, Steve, Ramtech's a graphics machine, And I used to kid and give a kid to him. I said, Steve, it's a strange ship that leaks from the top. This is not a graphics machine. This is something new that's sort of undescribable to people who haven't witnessed it. And what's one of the interesting things was, of course, Steve had no software, right? His whole focus was on downsizing the hardware, making it, a consumer product, and so he went to Gates to get his software written, right? And he comes back to Apple and says, I just made the greatest deal in the history of mankind. And to the team, executive team, we said, what's that? He goes, Bill Gates is going to write my word processor and my spreadsheet for $1 a copy. And I said, Steve, what's the going rate for application development? Minimum 15%. Why do you think Bill's willing to do it for $1? I said, you just sold the corporate jewels. Okay. Now, remember, you couldn't develop software on the Mac. So we had to send leases to Microsoft. So I had the privilege of showing Bill Gates the Lisa for the first time, all right? And I had built a room, today at Apple it's called the executive briefings, right, rooms? Well, I had built a special room, we call it the sneak preview room, and it had curtains in the back with 6 leases that we could draw and pull, and Pirelli floors, and we used it to introduce corporate America to what Apple, who Apple was going to be, not what they were. In fact, I asked one of the executives one time, how many Apple IIs do you have? And he goes, probably got 20 or 30 of them, right? A week later he called me. Remember, there's no email in those days and no chat messaging. And he goes, I was intrigued by that question. He goes, so I started a survey, and he goes, we're at 2,000 and I'm still counting. Because what? They came in from the bottom. People bought the Apple II maybe 1 month, and the second month the disk drive, and they bought VisiCalc to not use the corporate financial package, or like me when I was at HP and doing a presentation. If I took my presentations into the graphics department, it was $1,000 a slide, and I got them back in 2 weeks. Now with the Apple II, I can do my slides, and change them dynamically day in and day out. So, anyway, I had to show Bill Gates the sneak preview room. And we opened the curtains, and we went from one computer to another because he was like a kid in a candy store. He was, wait a minute, slow down. So how'd you do that? How'd you do this? How'd you do that? Ironically, years later, he called me when Apple and Microsoft were in the lawsuit, and said, could you come up and spend the day with me and talk about this? I always thought that was interesting that Microsoft asked me to come in, but Apple never had asked me to come back in. And so I said, sure, I'll come up, Bill. And my son Christopher goes, can I go? Because he knew Steve, but he didn't know Bill. So I said, sure. Bill picks us up at the airport, his Lexus. The whole back seat is books. Just books. Slides him aside. Chris sits in the back seat, drives us to his office. We get to Bill's office, and I'm ready for Bill to start pumping me for information to help him with a lawsuit. And instead he looks at Chris, my son, and says, he goes, you should know the I forgot the word was, the impact that your dad has had on our industry. He said, when he showed me the Lisa and I brought it back, he goes, I thought my company was over. And he said, I ripped everything apart and put all the focus in that particular area, which I always thought was very nice of Bill to, build you up in front of your son, right? And then from that point on, we started chatting about things. And particular, I had gone to the University of Zurich, to meet Professor Wirth, because he was the creator of Pascal, and that was one of the first high-level languages I put on the Apple II, was the UCSD Pascal. And apparently there was a project there similar to the Xerox project that he was asking me if I had seen, because he was trying to find prior data that said, this already existed and it wasn't just Xerox, and it was in the, probably the research public domain type of thing. But yeah, so that was an experience which I'll never forget, was showing Bill the future of personal computing.